this is Pat Lynch, and you are listening to the Career Pathways Podcast, brought to you from KILT Studio over at Lyon College. Joining me on the KILT Studio team, as always, is...
Producer Cheyenne.
She's in the background, but she's always there making magic happen. And Cheyenne, just thank you. You know, you've been a great team. Producer Jason, who has been with me for a couple semesters, he's now in France, and he's enjoying himself. But producer Cheyenne came in, did well. Got some compliments from the other podcast. You saw that? No, okay. Now, to our guest today. We haven't. I want to make sure. I always somehow get everybody's title wrong, but it's Dr. Dave Thomas. He is the W.D. Bryan Professor of Biology.
Correct.
All right, man. It's starting out already as a good thing. And Dr. Thomas, welcome to the Career Pathways Podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Oh, awesome. We always start out just very general, just kind of asking you kind of tell us about yourself, kind of like your career and how all the steps that kind of got you to Lyon College.
That's gonna be a long one.
Oh, we got all the time in the world, you know. We can, and then just to kind of get some context as far as who you are, and we'll go from there.
Okay. I am not a native Arkansan, although I've lived here for 25 and a half years. I'm originally from Washington State. I was raised and educated throughout the Pacific Northwest.
Mm-hmm.
So my undergraduate was at Central Washington University, where I majored in biology, paramedic, and minored in psychology. I then went up to the University of Alaska at Fairbanks for a year to start work on my master's, because I was really interested in extreme environments, and my whole goal up there was I want to do field research in Alaska.
Oh, okay.
So I got up there, and the professor I worked with, really great guy, but he himself had just been appointed as new assistant professor. And
right.
He just didn't quite have the funding yet, so he got to go in the field and bring stuff back. And so I started looking around for another way to do things. And so I was looking down at Arizona State, and there was a professor there who worked on Arctic mosses and lichens. And so he already had these in culture, so he didn't have to go anywhere. So I decided, well, I was going to transfer down there, and my advisor at Fairbanks was really supportive and everything. So I get everything ready to go, and like a month before I'm done with my last semester at Alaska, they said, "Oh, I'm sorry, he retired."
Yeah.
So I was already kind of just on my way out from Alaska. The good news is I had met my wife there, and so we decided she was in an anthropology program there and hated it. She loved Alaska, but just the people she was working with she didn't like. So we both ended up moving down back to Oregon, where I got a job as a research analyst for a chemical engineering firm. Little place called Myrtle. No, it was called Umpqua Research in Myrtle Creek, Oregon, little tiny town. But their claim to fame was they made this thing called a microbial check valve that flew on every single space shuttle to keep the water purified. Right. And then we were also working on a water purification system for what was still called back then Space Station Freedom, later became the International Space Station. And so that was kind of fun work. It didn't pay really well, but the thought of I was working on Space Station was great. And then, as so often happened with that project, about every few years, Congress would go through and say, well, you're wasting too much money, you're not doing it right, go back and replan it.
Right.
And that happened to us, and so we lost that contract. And my bosses had said, well, if you want to, you can go back to work in the commercial lab where I had started there. And I said, yeah, I think I'll go back and finish my master's degree. So I went back to my alma mater at Central Washington, spent 2 years there to finish up a microbiology master's degree. I had also had my first child at that time, so my older daughter was born. I don't recommend that, guys.
Yeah.
Don't have kids in grad school.
Right.
And by then I was just kind of exhausted, so I decided I was going to go to work for a few years, and then we'll think about advanced degree after that. So I went to work at what is now Southwestern Illinois College. It used to be called Belleville Area College, just across the river from St. Louis. So this was a big community college. It was about 15,000 students on 3 different campuses. And basically, I was the lead microbiologist. I had an office mate who was also teaching microbiology, but he was a retired veterinarian. And he and I had a lot of fun. He was just as kind of a role model of, he was late in his career. In fact, he had finished his first career and decided he wanted to go into teaching. But I found that the attitude of both many of the students and the administration was that this was the 13th and 14th grades of high school.
Yeah.
Grade inflation was rampant,
Okay.
and they didn't even try to hide it.
Yeah.
And I would routinely get these notifications by my dean saying, you're expecting too much of our students. And this is at a college that is supposedly linked into University of Illinois.
Right.
And they said, any of our colleges should be the equivalent of theirs. And I said, no, you're not.
Yeah. Right.
And I just got fed up with it after a while, So after about the 3rd or 4th time of you're expecting too much of your students, I said, you're right, I am.
Yeah.
And I went back to school, this time at the University of Idaho, to do my PhD.
Yeah, you have covered the Northwest.
I have. I'm all over
yeah,
the place up there. And part of the reason was because it was there, because both my family was there, my wife's family was there. By this time, I'd had my first son. He was born while I was working in Illinois, which was not while I was in grad school. That was a better thing. But we decided that this was going to take 3 years minimum. And we wanted some place that we actually liked living in, because we didn't like Belleville that much.
Home of Jimmy Connors, I think.
Something like that,
yeah.
yeah. I don't follow tennis either.
I
so.
played no, that's what the tennis nerd would know that.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, and by now, I had some teaching experience. In fact, I had such a heavy teaching load. I usually taught 5 laboratory courses every semester.
Oh. Okay.
And so that means going in, I actually had more teaching experience than most of the assistant professors there, because they're all mostly research professors. I try not to tell them that too often. It made them antsy. But I also, this time was looking, both at places and at people. So I was looking at, all right, who exactly do I want to work with? What are they doing? Things like this. And so a guy I'd corresponded with at University of Idaho, his name's Steve Herbert. I told him that I had actually applied for a doctoral grant from NASA. And if we got it, it would pay for my 3 years there, and as well as some research supplies. And so I'd come up with a proposal and everything. And after a couple of just introductory messages, I said, Steve, this is what I want to do. Can we do it in your lab? And he looked at it and said, yeah, go ahead. Yeah. And that was our relationship the whole time I was there. It was not, I'm the student, he's the professor. We were partners the whole way through. It ended up, I didn't get the grant, but he said, okay, well, we can't do that without the money, but this is what I'm doing. And he was doing stress research on photosynthetic bacteria. I said, yeah, that sounds really interesting. Yeah. And so, so after 3 years at University of Idaho, I graduated with a PhD major in botany and plant physiology, because I didn't work on plants per se. I was working on photosynthetic bacteria, but botany departments, that's where you put photosynthetic bacteria because they're green. All right. And then I ended up, he had just gotten another grant that included 1 year for a postdoc salary. And so I had started applying for jobs, but most of them want you to have postdoc experience. And so I ended up staying there another year as a postdoc. And then as I was looking for places to go after that, one of the places I applied to was Lyon College.
Yep.
I came out here in February, and it looked a lot like it does today. It was gray.
Yeah.
All the trees were bare and everything. It wasn't raining, though. But I right away it felt really homey here.
Yeah.
Because I could see with all the trees and everything, I could envision what it was going to look like in the spring. And just as I was walking to different places to see people with some of the other faculty here, it was really obvious that everybody knew everybody.
Yeah.
And that I had never experienced that. I thought I went to a small college, which at the time was about 5,000 undergrads.
Right.
Which I knew a few people, but most of the people were strangers. Here it was really obvious that the students knew who the professors were.
Right.
There was engagement between the two, just walking to the cafeteria or something like that. And I thought that was really, really neat. That is what I wanted to get into teaching for. And so I applied to a few other places, but ended up taking the job here.
Yeah.
So in the fall of 1999, I started off as an assistant professor of biology. My expectations were that I would teach microbiology and biochemistry.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. Going back in your career, like starting out in undergrad and kind of steps away, you kind of had academia and private business. Well, just going back, if you're a 21-year-old, what did you see at that time, like that was going to be your career?
Well, let me back up just a little bit more then. In high school, I met the director of emergency services for the American Red Cross.
Mm-hmm.
And I had done search and rescue as what was then called the Explorers Program, as part of Boy Scouting. So I was with the Yakima County Sheriff's Search and Rescue Unit. And I'd been talking to this guy, and on search and rescue, I had to be first aid certified. In fact, I was advanced first aid certified. And Red Cross, what they would end up doing is anytime there was like a horse race or motorcycle races, BMX races, things like that, they wanted to have someone manning an aid station.
Right.
And so there would usually be two of us there. And another friend of mine he had graduated high school like 4 years before I did, but he still hung around and did things like that. He was an EMT, and he had made the introduction and said, so, would you like to be doing this? And I did. So by the time I was 14, I was doing aid stations for the Red Cross. And I continued doing that all through high school. And then I had the opportunity in college to take instructor courses.
Mm-hmm.
And so I actually started my teaching career at 18, teaching first aid and CPR courses for American Red Cross. And so that's, I did that throughout most of my college career. And I was one of those kids, I wanted to do everything in college. Everything was just so interesting. So I started out, when I applied, I was going to be a chemistry major. By the time I got there, I was going to be a math and computer science major. And then I was going to be a psychology major, because things like what is intelligence and questions like that kind of intrigued me. I actually did finish a minor in that.
Yeah.
And then Central Washington had one of the first nationally certified paramedic training programs.
Mm-hmm.
And I had been doing all this emergency medical stuff before that. I said, that sounds like a really fun and exciting job. And so I got my EMT finally after all the first aid stuff. And then the year after was admitted to the paramedic program, which was so exhausting.
Mm-hmm.
If we weren't in class, we were on the ambulances, in the ER, in the surgical ward, wherever. It was a very hands-on program. And by the end of that, so that basically took me a year and a summer.
Mm-hmm.
By the end of that, I had also gotten some of the negative aspects of the medical field in general, including the preponderance of lawsuits and things like this. And I got, and even, my new colleagues who worked ambulances and things like that were afraid of being personally sued for things that weren't even their fault, and so I had to say, maybe this isn't for me. And I looked into becoming a medical doctor for just a little bit. But that introduced me to full biology. And so I got very, very interested in biology, especially things like primordial evolution and the origin of life, and the possibility of life on other planets.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of my very first. So I actually worked as a paramedic while I was still in college. And then I did a lot of other jobs too. I worked as a maintenance person for a big country club about hour and a half outside of Yakima. I did that for 2 summers. I worked as a night auditor for a hotel for about a year and a half.
Okay.
Which basically, it was a little hotel,
Right.
but so I would work from 6 in the evening till 2 in the morning, and often had an 8 o'clock class after that. That was horrible. But I was basically everybody in the front desk, and during most of the week, it was not a hard job. So I had time to study or, watch a movie or whatever it happened to be, and just, a customer came in, I could take care of them, and
Right.
but it at least gave me study time. And then in between some of those other things, so after I had left Umpqua Research, my wife, who we'd been married at that point for like 4 months, she had taken a job with the Forest Service on the other side of Oregon as a as a district anthropologist. And about the time that I was wrapping up my job, I managed to get a job over in the same place, so we weren't distance marriage here.
Yeah.
And so I worked as the technical title was a range technician. In practice, I was a district botanist, and so I would go out and do sensitive plant surveys, make sure that if they were going to run cattle, they weren't eating the endangered plants and things like that. And basically, I got paid to go hiking.
Yeah.
Which, if I could have made a permanent career out of that, may have taken my life in a completely different direction.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Currently, I know you do a lot of research with students, like here on campus. Can you kind of speak what kind of research projects you have going on at the moment?
At the moment,
or even in the
I'm gonna have to work up to the
or
moment
like
here.
a greatest hits or whatever.
Yeah. So when I first came here, I was still doing some research on stress responses and cyanobacteria and things like that. And when I was at University of Idaho, I kind of did this side project. I was trying to figure out how I could get it in, but I was really interested in how photosynthesis evolved when we didn't have any oxygen in the atmosphere, for example, and the carbon dioxide level was like 100% or close to it. And so we started doing that with students.
Would that mimic life on another planet? Is that
similar to what we think Mars was
Right.
at about the same time
Yeah.
that Earth would have been forming.
Sure.
We think Earth and Mars were very similar at the time. And so we were doing all this in test tubes that we would just flow really high CO2 environments through these things and see how they grew. And so we did that for a couple of years, and I had students working with me from my second semester onward.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever had a semester without students working for me anymore. But we were doing that for several years, and that caught the attention of the chief scientist at a place called SHOT, which was Space Hardware Optimization Technologies.
Yeah.
It was a little engineering firm over in southern Indiana, and they were doing things like making hardware to do biological experiments on the shuttle and on the space station. Right. They're now called TechShot for legal reasons I don't want to get into. And so their chief scientist approached us at a conference we were at, and he said, "This is really interesting. I want to tell you about something we're doing at SHOT.
Yeah.
We're applying for a grant," and they call them NIAC grants. It was the NASA Institute for Advanced Concepts, and these were like high risk but high gain type things. So there's a good chance the project would fail, but if it didn't, these would be kind of big payoff type things. And so what he was looking at was, could we build a simulator, or they were building a simulator that could mimic Mars' atmosphere from what it is today to what it was 4 billion years ago, or what it might be like if we could change it, intentionally instead of negligently like we do Earth. And so we got, the company actually got that grant, and 2 biologists were invited to come in to do it. I was one of them. The other one was Penny Boston, who's now the head of astrobiology at NASA Ames.
Whoa.
Yeah, she was and still is quite the biological big shot. And so between the two of us, we were running different types of bacteria. I was doing mostly photosynthetic stuff. She was working on chemosynthetic bacteria. So these are, in a nutshell, bacteria that eat rocks to gain energy.
Okay.
And she was doing these.
Eating a rock, what kind of nutritional? What kind of nutritional value would
gloss
there be?
over the details here. Okay, so in most rocks, you've got things like iron and manganese and other metal ions that make up part of the minerals there. And certain bacteria can actually extract those minerals from the rock, use the oxygen in the atmosphere, and essentially make cellular energy, ATP, just using completely inorganic processes. And this is leading up to how I got into caves next. So Penny had done this because on an earlier project, she had been asked to come do the microbiology for this big cave project that another geologist had been doing. And so she'd gotten involved in that. And so she was telling me about these really cool bacteria she had in the caves. And the project was kind of winding down, and we were ready if they wanted to do a sequel to it, which they actually did later. But this got me thinking about, Arkansas has lots of caves in it.
Right.
And one of my colleagues, the late Mark Schramm, who is an ecologist, he wanted to put a cave biology module in his ecology class. Right. And this would have been about 2007. So by now, I was in my first term as division chair. And so Mark had asked me about this. And I said, yeah, but you have to bring the division chair along. Yeah. And so we went and did the wild cave tour at Blanchard Springs, and brought all the students for the ecology class and everything. And it worked out really well, except that it was really expensive. At the time, it was $50 a person to do this. It's actually doubled now. And even right now, they don't do it because they don't have enough guides. Yeah. And after COVID, everything got messed up. Yeah. So we had done that, and while we were doing it, there were I'll just call them mineral deposits that I was seeing that reminded me of the work Penny Boston was doing. And I had asked the guide about it. He'd been one of these guys that had been on there for like 25 years. He knew everything about the cave. And he had said that, he had been told that bacteria are doing that. And I think, yes, they are. That's manganese oxidation you're seeing there. And so I asked him, how do you go about getting permits to do research in the cave? And so he had told me the whole process, and I went through it. And so for about 4 years, we were working on Blanchard Springs, as well as a lot of other caves around here, and collecting bacteria and other microbes from all these caves. And by about 2018, we had thousands of samples that we were trying to characterize and things like this. Dr. Oliveda had come in about midway through this, and so she and I started a collaboration where she was using molecular genetics techniques to identify a lot of the bacteria for us, which made things a lot faster. And then COVID hit. Yeah. And a lot of caves that are already closed because of white nose syndrome, this disease of bats that was killing off all the bats. So that had already blocked some of our access. And then when COVID hit, caving is a very intimate activity. Yeah. You're all right next to each other, breathing each other's air and things like this. Yeah. And so with COVID, it was just out of the question.
Yeah, I had a work colleague who was spelunking. Yeah. And it was and I was like a hard pass.
Yeah. We call it caving. Spelunking has gained a negative connotation as people are, in there with their flip-flops and a pen light in their mouth. Yeah. The people we have to go in and rescue later.
Glad I wasn't one.
Yeah, so we call it caving. Yeah. I like the term spelunking. It just sounds cool, but it's kind of taking on a negative connotation. So when COVID hit, that kind of wiped out everything. So for one thing, they had closed campus on us. Yeah. For about a semester. which means we couldn't come in and do the culture work and things like this. And so by the time that we got back to a normal routine where we could work in the labs and everything, we had just lost a lot of the cultures.
Yeah.
So that, yeah, and we still had the problem of we didn't have a vaccine yet, so we couldn't be together in the cave and working on it. And so at that point I decided, well, maybe it's time to change focus to something we can do that's less enclosed. And so that's also about that time I was reading an article, and to give you a little background, for decades now we've known that microorganisms can travel in the wind. And I don't mean, breezing across campus, I mean across oceans.
Yeah.
And so there had been studies by NASA that monitored fungal spores that get blown up, say, in a desert storm in the Sahara, and they could watch that cloud of dust go across the Atlantic and come into the U.S., and lo and behold, these African fungal spores would end up in the U.S. And for the most part, they were harmless, but for some people, it might be allergic to them. And so we had known that, okay, this is a transport mechanism. And then a group in France found actively metabolizing, reproducing microbes in clouds. And that nobody had seen before. But about 10, maybe 20 years earlier, a couple of researchers had speculated that Venus has clouds. They're made of sulfuric acid, but it has clouds. And the surface of Venus is the hottest surface in the solar system of any of the planets.
And it's just it's like all water, isn't it?
No, it's all dry. It's like 900 degrees down there. It's hotter than Mercury, which is even closer to the sun. So it's bone dry down there. It's completely inhospitable to life as we know it, and even life as we might even wildly speculate. But it turns out up in the cloud layer, it's about human body temperature. And so there had been a couple of astrobiologists who had speculated that, well, there are life on Earth that can live at this temperature, that can metabolize sulfuric acid. They use it in place of oxygen. And so, it's not, even though the surface is nasty, it's not completely out of the question that we couldn't have that there. And then after I had seen this article on the group in France, we would think, well, that's okay. So we've got stuff that lives in clouds on Earth. We've already seen this kind of speculative piece, maybe on Venus. And so we did a complete shift in gears. And I was just thinking, okay, how do we collect microbes from the atmosphere? And in the past they've done it with like weather balloons and things like this. The problem with a weather balloon is that once you let go of it, you don't know where it's going. And it can go really high, which is the good thing about them. But they're born on the wind. There's actually a group over at Arkansas State that uses what are called balloon sats, and these are little payloads they put on weather balloons. And they've got GPS locators and parachutes and everything on them, so you can find them in the end. But you're still you never know where they're going. And so I was saying, well, I've been building model rockets since I was about 10. Could we build a rocket to carry a payload that's both small enough but robust enough and useful enough to actually sample microbes? And so I came up with this thing called the Launchable Automatic Device for Capturing Airborne Particles, or LADCAP. And basically it's a vacuum pump and a filter membrane with a computer on it. And so we launch this up in a rocket at either a predetermined time or altitude. It turns on the vacuum pump, it sucks in the air with all the microbes in it onto that membrane, turns itself off again, brings it back down to the ground.
Where's it peak as far as height?
It depends on how big of a motor you put in it.
Okay.
So
is there a target level though to get the proper data collection?
It depends on what you're looking for. So right now we're still in the process of getting it to work every time, all the time. And so we're flying around 300 meters, or around 1,000 feet. And that we can do. We don't have to have special FAA clearance or anything like that. Now, along the road, I did get certification, so I can launch the ones that you have to have FAA clearance for. And around here, the highest we can do is 6,000 feet. And that's over, strangely enough, just outside of Memphis in Shelby Farms Park there.
Okay.
So you can do, there's a rocketry club there that routinely gets the FAA clearance for high power launches. But 6,000 feet is still not even as high as airplanes go.
Right.
And so, once we get this to where we've got a really good, reliable package, we'll probably have to go out west.
Right.
As you go into the desert Southwest, and there are facilities there that will get you to the edge of space if your rocket can do that. They have the clearance to do that type of thing. So that's kind of where we're going is eventually to make a high power rocket that actually gives us some high atmospheric data.
Your discussion as far as the existence of, like, say, bacteria on Mars, Elon Musk, if you're listening, but what well, if you want to go there, we can, but what's your opinion as far as, because there's that, there's this whole, speaking of him, but there's this kind of incentive or push to go there, but you, as a biologist, I mean, how do you kind of critique this?
I'll tell you, my very first scientific article was on the possibility of life on Mars.
Oh, okay.
So back when I was in grad school, I was doing what was a graduate class project that could be anything on soil microbiology. That was the class. And so I'd asked my professor and said, well, does it have to be earth soil? And he said, go for it. And so I did a big research review of everything that had happened, basically from 1970s with the Mariner and Viking projects, and those went till the early 1980s. And then we didn't do anything on Mars for close to 15 years there. Right. And so most of the astrobiological data we had came from Viking, because those actually had supposedly life detectors on them. They turned out to be more like E. coli detectors and not what we would actually expect on Mars. And so that paper I wrote was a review of what we knew and possibilities for, the surface is really, really inhospitable, but what about protected areas? And I focused on these things called endolithic bacteria. And these are bacteria that live in between the mineral grains on rocks. And so there's a group also with NASA who was doing Antarctic research, and they worked on these rocks. In fact, if anybody ever wants to see one, you can come by my office.
So this is an actual rock extracted from Mars that you
Nope. This was Antarctic rock.
Oh, okay.
But Antarctica, even though it's got snow and ice there, it's actually one of the driest places on Earth.
Okay.
Because they don't get a lot of it, and it's very cold. So it's cold and dry like Mars. And they were studying these rocks with the bacteria in them to see, just what is their limit of life. Right. And they're looking at things and saying, a colony in this rock grows one cell every year. Yeah. Really, really low metabolism. And so I had come up with this whole speculative ecology of how, based on these types of organisms, not only how they would survive, but how they would propagate to go elsewhere on the planet and things like that. And that was my very first scientific paper. And since then, I have really been, even though the work I did for my master's and for my doctorate were more mainstream microbiology and physiology, that's always been with this, thing in the back of my mind that, all right, how can I apply this to the astrobiology stuff? And that was one of the nice things about coming here, since it's not a big research one university. Nobody cares if I suddenly change gears. Yeah. Because I'm not bringing in $1 million in grant.
Yeah.
And so I think we lost track here. What was I saying?
No. Well, we were talking. It was all about as far as life on Mars.
Life on Mars. And so, my conclusion was that it's probably not on the surface. Yeah. But we can't rule it out. Yeah. And even beyond, since I wrote that that was back in 1991. We found more and more evidence for things like subsurface life, both on Earth and potential places on Mars, and going back to caves. So one of the things that these Mars orbiters have been showing us is that there are lava tube caves on Mars.
Yeah.
And so these provide much more protected habitats, not only for possible extant alive stuff right now, but also possibly as repositories for fossilized life.
Yeah.
That's something we find in the caves around Batesville, is there's lots of fossils in these caves, and so you may be able to find the same thing, although we're limestone caves and Mars is lava tube caves, a little bit different possibilities there. And then one of the other things after these caves have been discovered that people were pushing the idea of, these would be great places to start colonizing.
Yeah.
You know, if you've got a cave that just has one opening, you can seal that opening off, put an airlock in it, and suddenly you've got a ready-made place to live. And Penny Boston, this colleague of mine from before, she actually did that, not on Mars, but up in Oregon.
Yeah.
So she'd gotten one of these NIAC grants again to, just to see what types of things would happen to a person who would be alone in this constantly dark environment. She had email access and computer access, but if I remember right, it was delayed just like it would be on Mars.
And
so it'd take 20
fresh
minutes.
water source. In the cave
so she had water, either in the cave or she brought with her. But she, all of her contact with the outside world. I think she had an emergency line that she did. All right, something's very wrong here. We're calling it quits. But everything was delayed by the same amount that a message going to or from Mars to Earth would be. So it could be up to 20 minutes each way.
Yeah.
And so, since that, my paper back then, the community at large has learned a lot more. I've learned a lot more. And overall, my outlook is the universe is simply too big to have us to be the only source of life. Now, our current targets, as astrobiology community, have now moved outward, though, to the icy moons of Jupiter and Saturn. So Europa, 99.9% sure that it's got a subsurface ocean that could harbor life. And then Saturn's moon Enceladus actually has water volcanoes on it. And so we know it's got water under there somewhere. The problem is they're so much further away. And so, if you remember the Cassini mission to Saturn, that was basically somebody's entire career was going from planning that mission to launching it, waiting all the time, and finally getting data back, and they spent 15 years doing that.
Yeah, amazing. Oh, goodness. With bacteria like on Mars, is that considered life?
Yeah.
Okay.
Nobody argues that bacteria are not life. Now, when you get down to the level of viruses, that's contentious because they're sort of like life and sort of not. But bacteria are definitely life. And one of the things that, if we could definitively say that there was an independent evolution of life on Mars, or there never was, that latter one's almost impossible to prove.
Yeah.
Both of those findings would be just groundbreaking. That it'd be a whole shift, because if we find life there that wasn't something that rode with us, that would mean that it's still only a sample size of 2, but would start to indicate that life is easy.
Yeah.
And if we'd show that life doesn't appear anywhere else, and I said that's proving a negative is something you really can't do. But if we could, that would also just be a completely different shift of our place in the universe. We'd actually go back to pre-Copernican times. And yes, Earth is the center of the universe.
Right. Yeah. One thing you were talking about, I'll call it microbes, but that can be transmitted like across the ocean and everything. What's that say as far as like if you're thinking of someone from the CDC and in terms of just things around like virology, you know, is that because it seems like we kind you talk COVID, but that's not the last
Oh no.
pandemic, and with a more of a a interconnected world, you can only imagine that that's going to be coming up again. It's just a matter of when. So
Right, and it's one of the things that it's not my expertise, but I follow it, and even since the mid 1980s at least,
right,
that people who do kind of environmental medical microbiology and, and how shifts in the environment will cause it, and they've been warning all this time that global climate change is going, it's going to cause shifts in weather and climate patterns, and those are going to cause shifts in where we see diseases.
right,
So even if you just take, the global warming and not worry about any other effects, that means things like malaria that are normally considered tropical diseases are going to start moving toward the poles.
because the whole warmer and warmer climate.
The warmer it gets, then the mosquitoes that carry
right,
those, they're actually a protist, but the mosquitoes that carry this can now have a wider range. And in the U.S., we've taken steps to eliminate their habitat. Now, it used to be actually back in the early days of the country, if you worked in Washington, D.C., that was considered hazardous duty because it was a swamp. And you had malaria and other mosquito-borne types of illnesses.
I've been in D.C. in August. It's rough. Yeah.
So we've drained the swamp, so to speak. But we get other parasites in DC now. But
there
it's
you
not
are.
the
Yeah.
mosquito.
Save that for the political show.
That's
but,
right. We'll just leave that there. I can't resist that joke though. But yeah, so and other things like yellow fever, and some of these other things that are generally considered tropical diseases, they're moving out toward the poles there.
Wow. This is a show, about, careers and we kind of talked about your career. What do you see as far as careers for the students that you've taught? Because you have such an interesting level of research. I know I do work with Sandy Beezer on coaching pre-med, now pre-dental, pre-vet, but I imagine the students who really get to work with you might all of a sudden start to think more about what could I do research-wise. Is that
I like to think so, but most of them don't.
Okay.
Because granted, most
right.
students who come to Lyon in STEM fields, they're looking at a medical career of some kind, and that's been true even before I came here.
Right.
So that's I've got 5 students currently working in my lab. 2 of them are pre-med, one's pre-vet, one's pre-optometry, and one's pre-physician assistant.
Yeah, and I could probably name them. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you probably know them.
Yeah.
But and it's been the same throughout. I've had students with me in my entire career here at Lyon. Very few of them were grad school candidates.
Yeah.
Most of them wanted to go into some sort of medical field at the post-bachelor level.
Yeah.
I've had a few. I had a couple of students that did go to graduate school. They ended up not doing research. I've got 2 who are working in commercial laboratories for big corporations, doing quality control testing, for example. One, after she left here, she went into the Navy and was a Navy officer for several years. So, I don't know how much she put her biology to use, but that liberal arts education.
Sure. Yeah.
I think she's teaching now.
Yeah.
But she was my first student here, and so I've haven't always been able to catch up with her. Right?
Right.
I catch up with her now and then, and yeah, she's had a varied career as
Yeah.
well. And it's,
Yeah.
you know,
You mentioned as far as that, being at Lyon, you have that flexibility that you can change interest and research focus. And so you kind of had a focus called macrobiology within caves. As far
yeah.
as,
So
and then moved to
rocketry and
Do you have something in mind for the future, or is it you're kind of staying put where you're at right now?
well, the rocket program is really still in its infancy, even though I've been working on it for 3.5 years now.
Mm-hmm.
But now that we've been able to get back into at least some of the caves, student interest in that has resurged. I don't know if I'll actually get back into doing a lot of cave research.
Yeah.
Because I'm also a lot older than I was before.
Climbing in, doing all the climbing.
Yeah, and that's it's kind of like scuba diving. It's an activity you really need to be honest with yourself about what you can do. Otherwise, you can quickly end up dead.
Yeah.
And I certainly don't want to bring students with me.
Yeah.
And that's really more my concern, is not so much that I get hurt, is that I'm in a point where I cannot help someone else keep from getting hurt.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, and that we ended up, even though we were there mainly to do microbiology, since, we could see all the bats and salamanders and stuff, we ended up doing a lot of population biology.
Right.
And then we would just hand those data off to the Arkansas Game and Fish, and they would just put it all into their database. And so, the guy that monitors that, he still bugs me every winter. So, you got bat counts yet? I said, since COVID, we haven't been back out there. So we're just getting back, and I don't know if we'll get to a point where we can do it regularly enough to have bat and amphibian data again. But that's one of the projects I still have on my back burner, is to publish all that data.
Yeah. Dramatic change subject.
Okay.
You have a lot of outside interest, and I noticed, kind of reading up on you, is that photography is kind of one, that kind of is. I'll just go and say it top of the list, but
That's what a lot of people know me for.
yeah. Tell me about that. How'd you get into photography? Kind of what kind of areas of photography interest you?
Okay. I started doing photography when I was about 7.
Okay.
I don't know where she got it, but my mom had given me an old Kodak 127 Brownie. Used roll film and everything in there. Yeah. And for a long time I was just a snap shooter. It's, there's my dog, click. And there's my brother, click. There's the moon, click. And I didn't really get into serious photography till I got into college. And it was a very fortuitous yard sale purchase that I was out with my dad just wandering around yard sales, and someone was selling a complete Raleigh 35 millimeter outfit. Now, if you don't know, Raleigh's a German brand of camera. They're outstanding optics, and she was selling the whole thing for $50.
Yeah.
And so I asked my dad, "Can I have $50 yet?" But this was a fully manual camera. It wasn't like cameras today where you just said, "I want to shoot sports," or "I want to shoot this." It was, you had to do the metering, you adjusted the aperture, you adjusted the shutter speed and everything. And so that made me learn the science of photography. Yeah. And it wasn't even until much later that I really learned the art of photography.
Yeah.
But I started out doing mainly nature photography, landscapes, things like that. And then as I got better with actually shooting people, which, aside, other than, shooting your kid having a birthday or something like that, it's actually really hard to shoot people and make it look good.
Yeah.
And so I did a little bit of wedding photography, mostly for friends and family. And I haven't done one yet. Sorry about that. It's an alarm on my phone.
Hello. Mars is calling us.
Mars is calling, yeah. So I think the last wedding I did was 10 years ago, maybe longer. But when I came here, one of the things is I lived in one of the campus houses. It's now being used, I think, by the soccer coaches, but it was right next to the gym.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was just out in the backyard one day, and I could hear stuff going on in the gym. Oh, I'll go check this out. Whatever's going on. It was a volleyball game.
Yeah.
And I was, and I always have my camera with me, because you never know when, it might be a fox out there or something like that. And so I said, see if I can take a decent picture of volleyball players and things like that. And initially I was awful. I shoot, and this was film, so this actually had a cost to it.
Yeah.
And so, I'd shoot through a roll of film and maybe get, maybe 4 really good shots. But it was kind of fun. So and it started with volleyball, because the nice thing about volleyball is it's kind of predictable where a player is going to be. Not completely, as a good player is going to be unpredictable.
Right.
But you can kind of predict about where a shot's going to be.
It's a 3-shot sequence.
Yeah. So you can kind of get into the rhythm, and and there's the spike, and and so I got reasonably good at that, and then. And so I was just shooting games, at my own expense, and for the most, I kept some of the photos. Most of them I gave to the girls.
Do you have a lab set, developing setup at home?
No, I had developing at Walmart.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so it did. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And actually, it costs more. There's a huge initial outlay if you want your own dark room, and that itself is another set of skills, which unfortunately I never got around to doing.
Yeah.
But I'd just send them to Walmart. And the nice thing about Walmart is at the time is if you had prints that you didn't like, they wouldn't charge you for them. So I'd go, and then basketball season came along, and and I was never much of a sports fan, but watching it live with people I knew. So it wasn't just LeBron James is a great player, but I have no idea who he is. So I have no stake in his life. But this guy that later became an orthopedic surgeon. And he was in my class and things like that. And so it's okay. So basketball can't be too much harder than volleyball. It is. It's a lot more.
Well, it's fast.
A lot faster. Yeah. I was doing that, and so for my first couple of years, that's basically what I shot: volleyball and basketball. And then one of the baseball players comes up to me, "Why aren't you shooting games?" Nobody asked me. And so by this time, I had worked out a deal with the coaches. Said, "You give me $50, and I will shoot as much as I can using that budget," which is actually about 6 games worth. And then if I really was just got into that game or something, I'd shoot some more at my own expense. And I did that for years and years and years. And keep in mind, at this time, we had no sports information director. We had virtually no marketing department. And I was it. And suddenly I was getting calls and emails. Do you have a photo from this game? Or do you have we need a photo of campus over here. Have you got one? And so that
was Flickr available at that time?
That was about 2004. And what I was doing is my Walmart film option now. You could also get scans of your negatives that they would do as part of the process for like an extra $1, and you downloaded them. And that was great because that way, I could put these up onto Flickr, link to them, and say, "Here, go look for yourself." And then I went digital in about 2005. And that, initially digital was not as good as film, but it was so much cheaper. You didn't have to buy the film, things like this. And then I'll call it a fortuitous accident. In 2010, the college had these things. Monday nights, they would have gatherings down at Morningside Coffee. Everybody could get a free coffee drink or whatever, and professors were encouraged to go down there and help students with studying, things like this. Well, I was on my way. I had my high efficiency motor scooter, bright red. Maybe its top speed was 50 miles an hour downhill. But it got like 100 miles per gallon, and I filled it up once a month, whether it needed it or not. So I was off to coffee, and a driver came out of Domino's and plowed right into me. And the interesting part was, social media was really kind of at its peak at this point. everybody knew that I had been hit before I even got into the ER.
Yeah. Wow. Oh, yeah.
But, so eventually after all my medical bills were paid and all this kind of stuff, I had about $5,000 left from the settlement. I said, I am buying myself a really good camera outfit.
There you go.
And I said, this is part of my physical therapy.
So what's your setup now?
Primarily I use a Pentax K5 and 2 of their kind of mid-range zoom lenses. And then I also have a Panasonic Lumix 1000 that I use when I don't want to bring the heavy stuff.
Yeah, because that's a pretty significant piece of equipment.
It's 10 pounds hanging on my chest.
Yeah. Okay.
If I'm in full photo mode, it's, in fact, I got rid of neck straps because they would hurt me. I'd have my neck bent over this all the time. And I've got these full camera harnesses. I call it camera bras. It's essentially doing the same thing.
Right.
It's holding these weights on my chest. But yeah, it's if I'm like literally on safari. We took a group of students down to Peru in 2012, and I had 2 cameras with me. I took another group of students to Germany and France just before COVID, and my wife took a shot of me. I had 4 cameras on me, and I was using every single one of them.
Yeah, you look like a press corps. Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, and so that really does. Yeah, I can just even tell with your voice it elevates just a notch talking about photography.
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah.
And so after that, it was everybody wanted me to do stuff because now it's all digital. And it wasn't until really about 2014 or so that we really ramped up so that we had more than just one person in marketing. We had at one point we had an SID and 2 assistants, and we had student workers who were taking, and still do. A lot of times you have student workers taking shots, things like this. And so it's got to the point where I don't feel like I need to go to the games because if I don't, nobody's going to take a picture.
Right.
So I still can't keep away from it.
No, it's great, and it's live action. That's just versus doing stills and everything. So, well, thank you so much for you. Long overdue, but no, I really is.
This is a lot of fun. I'm glad to be here.
Enjoyed the conversation. So, well, thanks again, and to our everyone who's listening, thank you for joining us on the Career Pathways podcast. We broadcast weekly, and this will be out in about 2 weeks.
Okay.
So, you have to get in line. Martha Beck is first. I'm sorry, but that's. But that
she's been here longer than I have.
There we go. It's a nod to seniority, but we hope you join us each and every week. And before we sign off, I have one burning question to producer Cheyenne. Where can you find the Career Pathways podcast?
You can find the Career Pathways podcast on 99.97% of all platforms.
She didn't add that that's the same percentage as what? You're afraid to say it.
Supposedly the same amount of germs that get killed with Germ-X.
Okay, because
about right. Yep.
Okay, she was cautious. Yes, she was worried. I got a biologist here in the house, so we're all good. So you've heard from 2 authorities, and but yeah, please, if you go find our podcast, subscribe, please. If you like what you're hearing, write us a review. And come back next week for another episode of the Career Pathways podcast. Take care.
This broadcast is sponsored in part by Lyon College and by KILT Studios.